Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maisha Wynn. It's such an honor to serve as your AERA president this year. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being with us in Los Angeles for our annual meeting. I have been waiting for this. I am so thrilled and so honored to introduce my friend and my dear colleague, Dean Bryan Brayboy. Bryan McKinley Jones Brayboy Lumby is Dean of Northwestern University School of Education and Social Policy, where he is also the Carlos Montezuma Professor of Education and Social Policy. Over a 25-year academic career, Dr. Brayboy has made a sustained investment in people, in the students, staff, and faculty who move through higher education, and in the work they carry with them long after they leave. He is known for rich theoretical grounding and rigorous research methods, and equally for his humor, humility, and genuine enthusiasm for the work. A member of the National Academy of Education and a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, where he was elected to the Council and Executive Board in 2024, Dr. Brayboy studies how different knowledge systems reveal the ways institutional structures support or hinder underserved students, staff, and faculty. In 2023, he received the George and Louise Spindler Award from the American Anthropological Association's Council on Anthropology and Education. An anthropologist by training, Dr. Brayboy is also deeply concerned with how culture and cultural practices can support Indigenous students and communities. He recently co-authored Ethnographic Methods, Training Norms and Practices, and the Future of American Anthropology, which was the most read article of 2024 in American Anthropologist, the flagship journal of the American Anthropological Association. Dr. Brayboy came to Northwestern from Arizona State University, where he was the president's professor in the School of Social Transformation and vice president of social advancement. He also served as senior advisor to the president and director of the Center for Indian Education and co-editor of the Journal of American Indian Education. From 2007 to 2012, he was visiting president's professor of Indigenous Education at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He is the author or co-author of 10 edited or authored volumes and dozens of articles, books, book chapters, policy briefs for the U.S. Department of Education, the National Science Foundation, and the National Academy of Sciences. His work has been supported by the Ford, Mellon, Kellogg, and Spencer Foundations, among other public and private organizations, and he has been a visiting and noted scholar in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Norway. Over the past 17 years, he and his team have helped prepare more than 165 Native teachers to work in American Indian communities and more than 41 American Indian PhDs. Dr. Brayboy earned his bachelor's degree at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and his master's and PhD awarded with distinction at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the father of 2 incredible sons. And on a personal note, I get to work with Professor Brayboy behind the scenes with AERA Council. He is passionate, he is disciplined, and he holds high standards of integrity for everyone on Council. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dean Bryan Brayboy.
There's a part of me that just wants to stop there. You've made me sound so good. Thank you. President Nguyen, my sister and my friend, for the opportunity and for your generous introduction. I do want to thank the sign language interpreters, Gustavo and Sandra and Kyle, for their great work. My name is Bryan McKinley Jones Brayboy. I'm the son of Bobby Dean Brayboy. He was the son of Eva Harris Brayboy and Tecumseh Bryan Brayboy II. I'm also the son of Mary Elizabeth Jones Brayboy. She was the daughter of Rosebell McMillan Jones and Zelma Sampson Jones. She was also the daughter of McKinley Jones Sr. When my parents got married, they made an agreement that if they had girls, my mom would name them. If they had boys, my father would name them. Much to my mother's chagrin, they had 3 boys. I am named after my grandfathers, Tecumseh Bryan Brayboy II and McKinley Jones Sr., hence the long name. From my father, I learned to spend money I didn't have, to be adventurous, to rarely say no, to be passionate about life, and to love my people. From my mother, I learned how to save and squirrel things away, to be passionate about life, to hold grudges. Y'all laugh, but it's true. And to love my people. I come from this small community called Prospect. That sign has bullet holes in it, but it says, "Welcome to Prospect Community, Cradle of Indian Prosperity." When I was growing up, it said, "Welcome to Prospect, Cradle of Indian Country." As President Nguyen said, I'm the father of 2 sons. That's Quanah on the left, Quanah McKinley Warner Brayboy. He is a really remarkable young man. He's currently in Puerto Rico playing professional soccer. Ely Tecumseh Warner Brayboy is on the right. He will finish and graduate next month and then move to, pretty great, and more importantly, has a job. He's going to move to Chicago. He will move to Chicago and work for this small consulting firm called Deloitte. That's me, and I'm not sure how old I was in that picture. I'm 6 or 7. My father was a healthcare administrator, and we had been at Second Mesa working at Hopi. You can see that, like, my mom had me in a Hopi haircut. She also made that shirt. She made all of our clothes. We didn't have a whole bunch of money, and she felt like she could actually make clothes better than the stores could. This is the love of my life and the mother of our children, and if they are smart and beautiful and handsome and great, it's because of her. I want to recognize the fact that I am on Tongva lands. I'm a visitor here. I recognize that. I made my slides. I never make my slides. The first one's a little bit wacky, so let me just kind of get through all the craziness. I was recently meeting with a well-known environmental scholar discussing the importance of preparing the next generation of conservation leaders. We'd been building the architecture for an institution that would connect the wisdom of indigenous peoples and communities with those considered expert in science and technology. At one point, I expressed regret that there were several indigenous scholars and others who were thought leaders in conservation but were not being taken seriously by the scientific advisory team of the project. I argued that their presence was necessary for us to advance our work. The senior scholar asked me about their academic backgrounds and scholarly credentials. I pointed out that some were members of honorific societies with impeccable academic credentials. Many of them were also community leaders who were carrying centuries of knowledge about conservation and sustainable practices. I argued that our effort to connect across knowledge systems required us to expand how we thought about expertise. At this point, the senior scholar told me, "We just need the essence of indigenous knowledge so that we can apply it to real science. Can you just boil down The essence? After I told him that the essence is connected to the bodies of peoples, the conversation wound down. Before we parted, the senior scholar told me that he intended to move forward, focusing on science that people would understand. By people, he meant others on the scientific advisory committee and a potential donor to the project. I wondered how conversations that erased the wisdom of indigenous scholars were still thriving in the 21st century. I later relayed the conversation to my friend and colleague Megan Bang, who told me they want all of our knowledge, but none of our presence. In this particular colleague's mind, it was possible to separate out the essence of many centuries, millennia really, of knowledge and understanding from the lived and embodied experiences of those who have the knowledge. According to this point of view, knowledge is rooted in particular kinds of experiences in specific historic moments can be distilled into an essence that breathes life into other ideas. It is the tension, this push and pull between the embodied and the scientific, between the lived and the learned, between presence and absence, that frame this address. This address is about the impacts and legacies of erasure, about the ways that embodied experiences of indigenous peoples have been made absent, removed from lands, removed from historical accounts, removed from collective memory, and removed from national consciousness. I argue that restoring our full presence across all of these domains is necessary, bless you, not only for securing the future of indigenous peoples, but also for securing the future of the planet. To this end, I want to make 5 points. First, I want to demonstrate that the past, present, and future are deeply entangled. Some argue that the best predictor of the future is the past. Some argue that those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. Still others might suggest that we are almost always in the status of being and becoming. Second, guided by the work of Arthur C. Parker, writing in 1916, I will argue that the history of indigenous peoples in the U.S. is rooted in ideologies of extermination, segregation, and absorption. Third, there are traces of history that are scattered in our memories and in the ways we think about education, schooling, and related policy. In previous work, I have asked questions about whether our legacies and futures are short-lived or long-lasting. As Sarah Green observes, and I quote, "Tide marks mix the notion of place with a sense of time passing in the different ways of different moments. A tide mark left by waves in the sand will disappear shortly. One left by spilled coffee seeping into the weft and weave of a white shirt may leave a long trace," end quote. This address focuses on the traces. Fourth, the erasure of indigenous peoples in broader U.S. society, schooling, and in the everyday lives of peoples is rooted in my assertion that myths have created a transformed sense of past, present, and future. Myths are often created and then told in order to make ideological points or when someone misremembers. Those myths are retold and retold again before they move from the status of myths to a new set of truths. There's profound epistemological, emotional, and human damage when myths become truth. Finally, I will argue that schooling, including its physical structures and sets of epistemological beliefs in the U.S., can be traced to the dispossession of land from indigenous peoples, and that this legacy of colonialism is still visible and influential today. Indigenous peoples in the U.S. were removed from the land so that peoples from Spain, France, England, and other parts of Europe and around the world could colonize the lands, hearts, and minds of the peoples on the continent. This is an address about remembering a history that has been forgotten or erased, like the peoples of the lands on which our schools and universities exist. I want us to remember it. In 1977, Bourdieu and Passeron introduced a concept of Genesis amnesia, that is, to forget the beginning, to not know the origin. They write that Genesis amnesia is the, and I quote, naive belief that things have always been the way they are, end quote. In this framework, this kind of forgetting influences widespread common sense beliefs that existing power relations have always been in place. Assumptions that things are the way they are circulate without an understanding that people with particular interests created the structures, and those structures benefit those who created them. As I and many of you have demonstrated, such hegemonic beliefs, practices, and structures are robust and difficult to disrupt. In 2000, Creek scholar Kate Shanina Loma-Waima wrote, and I quote, "The history of American Indian education can be boiled down to three simple words: battle for power," end quote. I would add that the history of indigenous peoples more broadly is rooted in a battle for power. The power resides in the quest for land. In 1916, Seneca scholar Alfred C. Parker published an article in the Journal of Sociology. The article begins by observing that, and I quote here, "The problem of what to do with Native American Indians has been the cause of much effort and discussion for 3 centuries," end quote. Parker offers an overview of how the federal government and religious organizations have dealt with their relationships with American Indian peoples. He argues that there are, quote, 3 great plans: occupy the land forcibly and by various means to exterminate its barbaric owners, segregation, absorption," end quote. These 3 strategies of extermination, segregation, and absorption overlay and intermix the points I'm arguing in this address, and I will continue to return to them. Parker writes, "For the sake of definiteness and to simulate constructive thought, we wish," and he's talking here really for the Society of American Indians that was founded in 1911. "We wish to lay down 7 charges out of perhaps many more that the Indian wishes to make at the American bar of justice." Parker goes on to connect the disposition of American Indians from their lands with other forms of dispossession. This is a long quote. "The people of the United States, through their government agencies and through the aggression of their citizens, have robbed the American Indian of freedom of action, robbed the American Indian of economic independence, robbed the American Indian of social organization, robbed a race of men, the American Indian, of intellectual life, robbed the American Indian of moral standards and of racial ideals, robbed the American Indian of a good name among the peoples of the earth, robbed the American Indian of a definite civic status," end quote. Dispossession is not just embedded in physical forms of violence. It also robs people of fulsome lives and futures. And now turn to an overview of the entanglements of the past, present, and future. As it turns out, history is not linear, although I'm going to present it as such for the sake of this argument. History is deeply entangled with the present and futures. We tell ourselves stories. Sometimes those stories are true. Histories are recursive, contradictory, and complex. The narrative of dispossession and erasure of indigenous peoples in the U.S. is also contradictory. It's been somewhat well documented that Benjamin Franklin drew liberally from the governing structures of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy or Six Nations to create the 3 branches of the U.S. government, among other things. Franklin was so enamored with the Haudenosaunee that he invited them to both the Albany Conference of 1754 and the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. In 1784, Franklin published a treatise entitled "Remarks Concerning the Savages of North America." Franklin was present at negotiations of the 1754 Treaty of Albany that ended with the Haudenosaunee trading lands for peace as part of a diplomatic process. In the remarks, Franklin retold one important interaction during the negotiations thusly. And bear with me, it's a long quote, but for me it feels really important. After the principal business was settled, this is Franklin talking, the commissioners from Virginia acquainted the Indians by a speech that there was in Williamsburg a college with a fund for educating Indian youth. And that if the chiefs, this is the Virginia delegation continuing, if the chiefs of the 6 nations would send down half a dozen of their sons to that college, the government would take care that they should be well provided for and instructed in all the learning of white people. Franklin continues, it is one of the rules it's one of the Indian rules of politeness not to answer a public proposition the same day that it's made. They think it would be treating it as a light matter, and that they show it respect by taking time to consider it as a matter important. They therefore deferred their answer till the day following. When the Haudenosaunee speaker began by expressing their deep sense of the kindness of the Virginia government in making them that offer, for we know, says he, that you highly esteem the kind of learning taught in these colleges, and that the maintenance of our young men while they are with you would be very expensive to you. We are convinced, therefore, that you mean to do us good by your proposal, and we thank you heartily. But you who are wise must know that different nations have different conceptions of things, and you will therefore not take it amiss if our ideas of this kind of education happen to not be the same as yours. We've had some experience of it. Several of our young people were formerly brought up in the colleges of the northern provinces. They were instructed in all of your sciences, but when they came back to us, they were bad runners, ignorant of every means of living in the woods, unable to bear either cold or hunger, knew neither how to build a cabin, take a deer, or kill an enemy, spoke our language imperfectly, were therefore neither fit for hunters, warriors, or counselors. They were totally good for nothing. We are, however, no less obliged by your kind offer, though we decline accepting it, and to show our grateful sense of it, if the gentlemen of Virginia will send us a dozen of their sons, we will take great care of their education, instruct them in all we know, and make men of them. Haudenosaunee are still like this, by the way. No offense, especially if the Mohawks are here, no offense. The Haudenosaunee leaders here really understand what Lyons calls the terms of the debate, and through which schooling in the northern provinces was intended to achieve particular ends. Their needs were clear. They wanted citizens to be able to speak their language, hunt, build housing, and manage cold weather. All of these are necessary to be fit for hunters, warriors, or counselors. The offer from the colonists to educate indigenous peoples in the university system was about removing the essence of the Haudenosaunee, erasing their experiences and knowledges. The offer was rooted in the ideology of absorption. As the Haudenosaunee were settling their own terms of debate, there was a different conversation happening further north and east. Colonists in New England, for instance, had adopted the practice of scalping to accelerate and amplify their efforts to remove indigenous peoples from the lands. During the 18th century, the Massachusetts Bay Colony placed bounties on the bodies of indigenous peoples, particularly scalps. In 1755, Spencer Phipps, the lieutenant governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay, proclaimed that the Penobscot peoples were enemies. He called on citizens and military to, quote, embrace all opportunities of pursuing, captivating, killing, and destroying all and every of aforesaid Indians, end quote. The compensation for killing the Penobscots was for every female Penobscot Indian and for every male Indian prisoner over the age of 12 years, 25 pounds. For every scalp of such female Indian or male Indian under the age of 12 years brought in as evidence of their being killed, 20 pounds. For every Indian enemy shall kill and produce the scalp to the governor and council on evidence, 300 pounds. I want you all to stop and think about how you determine and demonstrate evidence that someone is under the age of 12. and over the age of 12 and what evidence you need. What kinds of bodily mutilations are involved. According to an online tool produced by the UK Office of National Statistics, 20 pounds in 1755 is equivalent to 5,871 pounds in 2026, or $7,871.25. You don't want to short people. At the time that I did this, 25 pounds is worth 7,339 pounds in 2026, or $9,839, and 300 pounds is the equivalent now of 88,069 pounds, or $118,074. At that time, indigenous peoples were more valuable dead than alive. This was primarily driven by a need to vacate lands and fueled by logics that dehumanizing indigenous peoples and saw them as a problem to be solved. These logics, the traces like those of spilled coffee on a white cotton shirt, remain intact even if the material consequences have evolved. Phipps represents the extermination ideology of the process that Parker laid forth. It wasn't just the governors of colonies who were concerned with the presence of indigenous peoples. The founding documents of the United States and some of its founding fathers also worried about indigenous presence. Thomas Jefferson, the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, wrote in that document, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Almost 30 statements later in that document, he notes, he, and by this he means the king, has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions, end quote. The Declaration framing indigenous peoples as savages when colonists were killing Penobscots in brutal ways is an early example of how mythologizing indigenous peoples as subhuman becomes a truth embedded in one of the U.S.'s founding documents. Savage indeed. At this point in the presentation, I admit that I feel a bit like the famous television salesman Billy Mays. For those of y'all who aren't old enough to remember Billy Mays, Google him and check out the YouTube, who exclaimed, "But wait, there's more." Unfortunately, however, with regard to indigenous peoples and land dispossession, erasure, and absence, it seems there's always more. So let me describe a few more events that illuminate what this looked like in the early days of the U.S.'s history. In 1783, George Washington wrote to James Duane, who was a Continental Congressman and the first post-revolutionary mayor of New York City, calling for the U.S. to, quote, expel the Six Nations from all the country they inhabit previous to the war. Washington then wrote, "The policy and economy point very strongly to the expediency of being on good terms with the Indians, purchasing their lands when the gradual extension of our settlements will certainly cause the savage, as the wolf, to retire, both being beasts of prey, though they differ in shape." Washington's view of indigenous peoples and a strategy to have them retire was pervasive at the time. Thomas Jefferson, in a series of private letters in 1803, suggested that the U.S. should seek, quote, to exchange lands which they have to spare and we want for necessaries which we have to spare and they want. We will push our trading uses. Jefferson's general plan was to force tribal nations into debt to seize their lands for expansion of the U.S. empire. To accomplish these goals, Jefferson and Washington were driven by ideologies of segregation with a healthy dose of extermination. In 1819, the U.S. Congress passed a bill called the Civilization Fund Act. It provided resources to start schools on reservation lands with the purpose of helping civilize American Indian children. Although it was largely unsuccessful, it was a move toward absorption. The next 50 years would be marred with a set of policies that started with President Andrew Jackson called Indian Removal Act, where much of the indigenous population in the U.S. was forcibly moved westward and placed on reservation lands. It was, in Parker's words, a solution of segregation. During the Civil War era, there were several overlapping events that were intended to further consolidate the dispossession of lands. Education and schooling are directly implicated in these movements. On July 2nd, 1862, Congress passed the Morrill Land Grants Act. It's later called Morrill I. Morrill II gets passed in 1890. According to Lee and Atone, in an investigative article called Land Grab University, the act took almost 11 million acres of land from 245 tribal nations and communities to create 52 universities. They write, and I quote here, "Behind the myth of land grants lies a massive wealth transfer masquerading as a donation. Altogether, the lands, when adjusted for inflation, were worth about $500 million. The Morrill land grants represented another form of dispossession, and the lands-funded land grant institutions took away from those originally set aside to segregate indigenous peoples. To be clear, it's not just land grants that benefited from this dispossession. My current institution, Northwestern University, and I say that realizing I may not have a job when I get back, is not a land grant institution. The university's founder, John Evans, however, was the territorial governor of Colorado during the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. The massacre was tied to a dispute over lands for a railroad and consisted of the U.S. Army brutally murdering Cheyenne and Arapaho women and children to force them off the lands so that the railroad could be completed. Evans was enriched in the process. He used those funds to start both the University of Denver and Northwestern University. When segregation and absorption failed, extermination followed. Post-secondary institutions were the beneficiaries. As Lee and Atone note, and I quote here, "There will be no higher education as we know it in the United States without the original and ongoing colonization of indigenous peoples and lands, just like there would be no United States. There's no moment or time or place or institution that is not deeply entangled in the violence of colonialism." APLU, or the Association of Public Land Grant Universities, agreed by writing, "Unquestionably, the history of land grant universities and other public universities intersects with that of Native Americans and the taking of their lands. That is forever part of our nation's story." Both of these quotes encapsulate one of my main arguments, that schooling is rooted in dispossession of indigenous lands. 2 decades later, in 1887, the General Allotment Act was signed into law. It further divided up reservation lands through a process of giving heads of household land allotments. It had the effect of forcing indigenous peoples to move away from collective land stewardship to individual land ownership and drastically reduced tribal lands. Kathleen Duvall, in her Pulitzer-winning book in 2024, argued that it resulted in an additional loss of 60 million acres of Indian lands at the time. This act had the dual force of segregation and absorption of both peoples and lands. The individuals who received the lands taken from individual peoples would begin articulating myths of being settlers and pioneers who tamed wilderness. These myths would become truths with each retelling of the tale. Simultaneously, former Army Colonel Richard Pratt convinced Congress to initiate boarding schools to remove children from their communities. Pratt argued that boarding schools would help absorb Indian children into the United States and, quote, "kill the Indian in him and save the man," end quote. Brenda Child argues the reality, and I'm quoting here, "The reality is that properties and assets were still at stake, and a campaign for land and resources was waged every single day of the boarding school era," end quote. In 1879, the first boarding school opened at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. By 1900, 20,000 children were in Indian boarding schools. By 1925, 83% of American Indian children were in boarding schools. Boarding schools emerged from both the desire to absorb children into a new culture and to acquire land. In our 2022 book called The School Prison Trust, Sabina Vaught, Jeremiah Chin, and I argue, quote, "The last great Indian war was waged against children." Quote. I would argue that the war continues, but it's important to note that the last Indian boarding school closed in 1980. The Boarding School Healing Group has argued that over 6,000 of the children in boarding schools went missing or died. It was in the shadows of the boarding school era, post-Reconstruction and the Civil War, and the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, and quest for recognition and true freedom by both Black Americans and Indigenous peoples, that Parker was offering his remarks on the injustices faced by Indigenous peoples in the U.S. One of Parker's contemporaries in the early 20th century was a philosopher-sociologist named William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois. In 1903, Du Bois published a small book of essays called Souls of Black Folk. In the opening paragraph of that book, Du Bois writes, and I quote here, "To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word, and yet being a problem is a strange experience," end quote. In my view, Parker might have asked, what does it feel like to be visible? Both Parker and Du Bois considered and were informed by past events in thinking about the future. For Du Bois, it was the failures of the U.S. related to freedoms of Black peoples in era post-Reconstruction, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. For Parker, it was the success of the U.S. in its economic, educational, and legal colonization of indigenous peoples of the U.S. and not giving U.S. citizenship to indigenous peoples. That citizenship was eventually granted in 1924. Before moving to the future, I want to return to the ways that the past, present, and future are entangled. So far, I've really just framed my address on the history of 18th, 19th, and parts of the 20th century. I'm interested in what it means to think about memories. And in remembering, memory and remembering requires a prior knowledge. Of course, there are false memories, which are important to the arguments I'm making in this address. Dene scholar Amanda Taccini and I, building on work that I did earlier with Jeremiah Chin, have argued that it's worth being mindful of false memories, and especially false memories as myths that become truths when they are repeated. Here's what we write. The power of myth is not in its initial telling. Power is in the initial retelling, and the one after that, and the one after that, and so on. In each retelling, the myth edges toward truth. And there we can see the ongoing harmful wreckage unfolding. The original peoples fade from existence, and the retelling of myths becomes the prevailing truth in their absence, end quote. I wonder, what does it feel like to be erased? To become a myth? Understanding the beginning helps us understand myths. Sometimes beginnings are rooted in new myths or new truths, the deep epistemological argument. It's also an ontological. And in many ways, the ideologies of the past are critical to imagining and understanding the present and the future. When Parker highlighted absorption, he was, from my perspective, also addressing the role of invisibility. If you absorb something, it disappears. It is consumed without a trace. Its existence and beginning are removed. We develop an amnesia about it, or we never knew it existed. When we are aware, we work to rewrite narratives to fit specific myths or ideologies. I want to offer a few examples of the 21st century. One of the charges that Parker lays at the bar of American justice is that the U.S., quote, robbed the American Indian of a good name among the peoples of the earth. A good name among peoples can show up in different ways. Removal of a good name could be in framing us as people as savages, us, or by situating them as caricatures like mascots. It can also happen through the appropriation of our wisdom. Returning to the opening vignette, my colleague wanted the essence of our ideas, but not our presence. Good names are stolen by hiding the truth of their centrality to larger economic, social, and governmental structures and creating myths that erase or absence them. The erasure of indigenous peoples is the removal of their good names. This is a trace. It embeds in the fabric of consciousness, like black coffee on a white cotton shirt. The use of dehumanizing caricatures or outright erasure of indigenous peoples in the U.S. is deeply ingrained. Perhaps the most essential way erasure is enacted happens in removal from really basic places. In reporting the 2020 election results, CNN used the following graphic to describe how people voted based on a racial category. American Indians were represented as something else. Now, y'all should know I've been called, people have said to me, "You're something else," but I don't think this is what they meant. This erasure is common enough that many non-native people neither noticed it nor found it objectionable. Making peoples invisibles is one way of ruining their good name among peoples of the earth. Making indigenous peoples invisible in the above instance is rhetorical. Behind rhetoric often lies forms of violence. At a socialism conference in July 2025, Dene scholar Melanie Yazzie argued that decolonization is necessary for a just future. Her argument was that colonization was killing people and the planet. In response to her comments on July 6, 2025, conservative pundit Ann Coulter wrote this on X to her 2.3 million followers. If you can't read that, it says, "We didn't kill enough Indians." There's overwhelming evidence to suggest that there were 120 million indigenous peoples in the Americas before contact. Almost half of them are what we now consider the U.S. In the 1910 census, there were roughly 210,000 American Indian peoples counted. The number represents 0.35% of the original population. See a bunch of mathematicians out here, so I'm a little worried about what I'm going to say next. For every 10,000 peoples in 1492, only 35 of them were left in 1910. To put this into perspective, according to population scholars, there were approximately 65 million people in Europe at the same time, 1892. The so-called Black Death in Europe killed approximately 30% of Europe's population at the time. The Black Death has been described as catastrophic. How then might we make sense of the death rates for indigenous peoples in the Americas? Coulter's assertion that not enough of us were killed is fundamentally a call for extermination. Extermination is an ideology. As an ideology, is a trace. Coulter made her comment less than a year ago. On September 2nd, U.S. Senator, in a speech called "What is an American?" given at the National Conservatism Conference in 2025, a U.S. Senator from Missouri, Eric Schmidt, said that, quote, "America is not a universal nation. American principles are not abstractions. They are living, breathing things, rooted in a people and embodied in a way of life," end quote. He went on, and apologies again for another long quote, to argue that the legacy of the U.S. and its European peoples is rooted in a belief that they were the most adventurous, the most courageous, the most curious and innovative of the English, Scotch, Irish, and continental Europeans who came as settlers and have spent hundreds of years building, fighting, and dying for a homeland for themselves and for their descendants. We're a nation of settlers, explorers, and pioneers, born of the ocean waters. They carried the first ships to our shores and forged in the crucible of a wild frontier. Our people tamed a continent, built a civilization from the wilderness, and wrote our nation's name in history. Our ancestors were driven here by destiny, possessed by urgent and fiery conviction, by burning belief, devoted to their cause and their God. The Continental Army soldiers dying of frostbite at Valley Forge, pilgrims struggling to survive in the hard winter soil of Plymouth, pioneers striking out from Missouri, for the wild and dangerous frontier and outnumbered Kentucky settlers repelling wave after wave of Indian warband attacks from behind their stockade walls would be astonished to hear that they were only fighting for a proposition. They believed they were forging a nation, a homeland for themselves and their descendants. America, in all its glory, is their gift to us, handed down across the generations. It belongs to us. It is our birthright, our heritage, our destiny. If America is everything and everyone, then it is nothing and no one at all. 1492, 1619, 1848, 1942, 1862, and 1882 would like a word. When I argue that myths have become truths, this is part of what I mean. Schmidt's narrative erased the ways that different peoples have contributed to the making of the U.S., and Schmidt seems to not understand how his own state is implicated in the erasure. According to Leon Attone, the University of Missouri, a land-grant university in Schmidt's state, quote, raised over $363,000 from land that was strong-armed from the Osage, $700, end quote. In her book, Vested Interest, published in 2025, historian Emily Connolly writes, quote, if land was the why of colonization, money was the how, end quote. Lands were removed, converted to property, and thus capital to forge a nation. Schmidt's truths are built on the lands of indigenous peoples after their removal and on the backbreaking hard work by black, brown, and yellow bodies. Myths become truths with each imagining and retelling. The U.S. has always been aspirational. Jefferson and Washington understood this, so did Franklin. The suggestion that the U.S. cannot be everything and everyone is fundamentally flawed. This ideology is rooted in scarcity-driven thinking. Value is derived from allowing some to access what others can't have. This way of thinking is also embedded in much of the U.S. school system. Some might argue that schools cannot be everything and everyone, and yet we still expect them to be. I'd like to propose a reorientation, a re-envisioning, a reinvestment in what schools do and can be. I believe we have work to do as researchers and practitioners of education to create the conditions for individuals, communities, and places to thrive. I believe it starts with adapting an ideology of abundance where we imagine that there is plenty for all, that everyone can thrive, and that the progress of one individual or group does not need to come at the expense of others. I propose that we create the conditions for young peoples in their communities to have freedom of action, economic independence, social organization, intellectual life, good names, and a civic status. These comprise the elements of a future of a future of one's own making. Parker understood this 110 years ago. So did Du Bois. So should we. Indigenous peoples and our essence in the U.S. are like the air we breathe in relation to history, present, and future of schooling, necessary and yet unseen. I would suggest that Parker and Du Bois were demanding that the U.S. must create the conditions for peoples to be seen as whole, as contributing members of society, of being visible in their fullness, of understanding that long-held agreements should be honored, even if doing so is considered inconvenient by the descendants of the peoples who have benefited from those agreements. When the Haudenosaunee rejected the colonists' offer to educate their young men, they did so because they had a definitive idea of what their young men should learn and be able to do as adults and future leaders. The explicit critique is punctuated by saying that the men who returned to the homelands were totally good for nothing. Totally good for nothing. I think we can learn from this cautionary tale. What would schooling look like if its goal was to help students be good for something? What would the good be? Or what would the goods be? I wonder then, what might schools look like if the goal was to help us create the conditions so that we are good for something, and that something should not just be or for generating financial resources. It should be for many things. To this point, up to this point in my talk, I've told a story and a history of indigenous peoples that's rooted in well-documented sources. It's a truth. For some of us, it's sad. For others, it's enraging. For others, it's not believable. Still others may hear it as a story of victimhood or victimry. Understanding a story like the one I've told as victimry is a convenience. We must reject the convenience. Extermination, elimination through whatever means, absorption, segregation, erasure, truth. I've turned to history to understand why things are the way they are and envision a different future. Haudenosaunee's response to the settlers, Parker's understanding of the conditions necessary for indigenous thriving, Du Bois's analysis of Black possibility are all traces and legacies that I want us to embrace and pursue. For me, they have become traces that will continue to influence my ongoing examination of educational practices and policies that have had a dramatic impact on futures, not only Indigenous students, but all students, and what I believe is possible in the not-so-distant future. This address is ostensibly about belonging, of being seen, a vision of freedom. Schools must be more than places that are driven by learning to read, write, do math, and science. Those are, of course, very important skills, but schools must be more. We can make explicit that there are meaningful sites where young people learn to be human and part of society. Schools currently sort and place students in particular boxes and teach young people how to categorize themselves as either good or bad at something. These hierarchies help define future prospects of young people. I wonder, why do we keep doing this? When will we imagine schools as places that can be built on healthy relationships between learning, the lands and waters on which schools sit, and life? Schools can be sites where children and their teachers and families and communities focus on the joys of learning, something new, driven by curiosity and growth. When Parker pressed for freedom of action, social organization, intellectual life, a good name, and civic status, he offered us a new way of imagining the relationships between schools, learners, places, and the future. We must imagine, we must build. Post-secondary institutions must do more than land acknowledgments and nods to histories. They must move away from absorption and assimilation toward an enactment of a vision of abundance. Post-secondary institutions must include an honest assessment of how and in what ways land disposition is factored into their origin, and to imagine ways that they may better serve the children and communities whose cosmologies are rooted in those lands and buildings. The assessment, however, can't just be an inventory of lands. It would require an assessment of what promises were made in return for the land, and accounting of how many Indigenous peoples have been served by the institutions and where there are opportunities to honor those commitments. If institutions were to engage in an accounting of the ways that they benefited from the removal of peoples from lands and act in ways to address the benefits of the removal, great partnerships could emerge. There are massive opportunities for coalitions and coalition building. Parker and Du Bois were ostensibly writing about freedom of thought, belonging, and full civic lives. What if we focus on freedom or on self-determination of individuals and communities? Parker was fundamentally arguing against absorption. Du Bois was advocating for full inclusion. Were their ideas in tension? I would argue that their agreement resided in their calls for freedom, choice, economic independence, abundance. What if we agreed that schooling should be rooted in the creation of choices, and that we were open to multiple pathways that all held standing importance? Would we work together toward the goal of freedom for all, rather than being mired in the arguments about the pathways forward? When we get stuck in arguing about the how, we lose the sight of the what. The how might be inclusion. It might be separation for the purpose of maintaining language and culture. The why is freedom. Self-determination and opportunities to thrive as individuals and communities are the why. Models built on scarcity, often rooted in belonging or unequal access to resources, have become normalized and taken for granted. Coalitions are rooted in abundance. That is, we agree that we can all have freedom in whatever forms and method that freedom takes. Abundance rejects zero-sum mentalities. Abundance reimagines that there can be fulsome opportunities for us all. Models of abundance remove hierarchies and limited choice sets and create the conditions for thriving. Diné scholar Brian Burkhart has suggested that for abundance to take root, we must reimagine Descartes' Cartesian principle of I think, therefore I am, centers the individual and creates the conditions for scarcity, to we are, therefore I am, which centers the collective. What if we committed to agendas of abundance, of freedom, of choice, of prosperity, of a good name, of being seen, of being included? We can do this. Our future demands it. What if? Thank you.
When all of you started pouring in here, our dear brother, Dr. Brayboy, said, I'm surprised all these people are here. But after that talk, none of us are surprised while all these people are in here, right? We always knew that's why we're here. Thank you. Moving toward abundance. We actually have time for some questions, and Dr. Brayboy has been gracious enough and wants to take questions and comments from you. We actually have a microphone that's right there. This is being recorded, so we would like for you to step into the aisle to ask your questions so we can catch the voices and the questions, please. So, do you have any questions? You can go to the center.
So I'm curious, Bryan, if you can say anything about intersections between African American activists and indigenous scholars, for example, with Parker and Du Bois actually writing at the same time.
Yeah, it's a great question. In the 60s, there was actually, I sort of lament the fact that there hasn't been more coalitions. It's one of the things I wish for. Dick Gregory and Vine Deloria Jr. in the 60s were working really, really closely together. They were taking up and using each other's methods. They were making arguments about the connections between land and labor, and that really sort of preceded larger questions of settler colonialism in a way that I find moving. And then at some point, it just kind of moved off to the side. And here's the thing for me about the power of coalitions, to your point. I think there's more people doing this now. Amanda Ticini and Eve Ewing had a conference a few years ago to talk about this. Lots of us are interested. Ananda Marin is doing some fantastic work in this area. Here's the powerful point about coalitions for me as I think about this, and I've got to figure out a way to say it. It's going to be a little rough when I do this, but I think in lots of ways, current hegemonic structures and power structures live and thrive in moments of silos. So if there are issues, that's a Black issue, that's a Native issue, that's a Latino issue. It allows us to not build about coalitions. So let me give you an example. Water is one of these really important ways to do this. So we think about water, It's a Flint thing. For black folks, it's a Flint thing. It's a Jackson, Mississippi thing. It's it's parts of Chicago thing. For Native peoples, water is there's this whole movement about a decade ago about really pushing against it, where water is life, and it becomes really critically important. Water is used as a weapon and weaponized against indigenous peoples, but also for us really being thoughtful about those arguments. If you think about groups of peoples traversing across the Sonoran Desert, looking for water, and Customs and Border Control puncturing water that has been left out, for people looking for opportunity, then it becomes a Latina issue. So there's a Native issue of land about water. There's a Black issue about water. There's a Latino issue about water. And for me, we focus on the immigration, or we focus on the poisoning of peoples, or we focus on the possibilities of a pipeline. I think the opportunities are for us to say, this is about water. And that builds, for me, the opportunities there to build coalitions. I just think there's really powerful work. And so Gregory and Deloria got this, and then it just kind of passed over.
But I was just saying, briefly, I think in some of the histories of the ways in which the ideology of white supremacy and colonialism have tried to continuously sort of pit these communities. So in the Declaration of Independence, they also go on to talk not only about the issue of the indigenous populations, but also about slavery and the problems of enslaved people, escaping to fight and so if you join the British, it'll be okay. And also for example, as I understand it, that during the period of African enslavement in the southern, like Florida kind of region, that peoples of African descent in escaping slavery would go into Seminole Nation and become, as a safe place to live. And the fact that you got Black Navajos and Black Cherokees and Black Seminoles, that I think there is an interesting way in which these communities have been supportive and understanding their common sets of challenges and the roots of that. And we don't have enough as part of the history and remembering of sort of documenting those.
I totally agree with that. Khalil Johnson's work on Black teachers at Navajo has been really important. I'm going to just come down here because I'm not, especially with you, Mama Lee. I like standing up there. I'm like, are you kidding me? I should be down on my knees. But I do think these larger questions, there's this whole conversation about freedmen and lawsuits where Blacks are welcomed into communities in Oklahoma and become citizens and are part of the roles. And then present day Native peoples are like, wait a second. And so there are these really interesting fights when it's like the opportunities there for me. I think we sort of miss some stuff. Now, there's a whole set of conversations. I've written a law review article on this with Jeremiah Chin, who's really brilliant about freedmen cases. But we probably need to do a bit more thinking across things that are very specific to us. But I do think white supremacy really resides in and thrives in places where we just silo these things. I should just say, I feel a little bit badly because AERA is an international organization. I've just talked about indigenous peoples in the U.S. I don't know anything about Canada or New Zealand or Australia. So there's lots of folks in the room who do. And so my hope is that there's opportunities for us to also think about these issues internationally. I mean, I think Joyce King, who's next door, is thinking about Korea, but I think Joyce is also thinking about indigeneity across in a global way, and we just need to have more conversations to that end. Yeah. Hi.
Hello, Qualito Nalito Nansinto Natiu, My name is Omar Tekbat Garcia. I'm from UCR grad student and higher ed. So one of the things that comes in my has brought up in my program is the Moral Act. I keep seeing that as a vehicle of dispossession for Indigenous people. And one thing that before the Moral Act came the doctrine of discovery. So if you can talk about that, anything you know about it, because that's something that's very interesting for me. So,
Thank you, Omar. I love your school. I think it's great. And one of my favorite people, a UCLA faculty member who's over there. So doctrine of discovery is really this notion that comes out of the papal bulls with the Catholic Church that really suggests a number of things, which was that if you're first on lands that are vacant, you plant the flag and you have the right to discovery of those lands. It was the Catholic Church who was really pressing this early on, and it led to this larger notion of manifest destiny, which is really kind of a movement west, but in the midst of that is this idea called the Norman yoke, which really comes out of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which essentially the argument was, if you come across vacant lands, you not only have the right to claim them, but you have the moral obligation to do so. And so there's a bunch of things caught up in religion in this, with the doctrine of discovery, with papal bulls, with Norman yoke, with manifest destiny. I mean, this is the traces that I was trying to articulate in the argument. Like, this is the black coffee on the white cotton shirt. It starts early with the papal bulls kind of saying, go out and do this and conquer things. And vacancy looks really different to lots of people, right? And so there are some really interesting opportunities here to have conversations about things, but I have to think about Senator Schmidt was making a huge argument around doctrine of discovery, really rooted in the myths around vacancy. I want you to think about like how many people were here. I mean, eventually it whittles away. Now the numbers are about 7.2 million for indigenous peoples in the U.S., which is pretty amazing in a century and some change. But so yeah, I don't know. I can say more about that. I don't know where you went, Omar. Very happy to say more and talk more about that. But there's a long history. Bob Miller's work on this, Rob Williams' work. There are two law professors, I think, that are doing pretty remarkable things. Jeremiah Chin, who's at the University of Washington, is also doing great work in this area. Hi.
Good evening. Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Gaurav Harshe. I'm he, him, his pronouns. I'm a PhD candidate. In a 2024 book, Dr. Upadhyay, who's the author of Indians on Indian Lands, actually examines the interwoven and simultaneous areas of dominant Indian caste complicity in processes of settler colonialism, anti-blackness, capitalism, Brahminical supremacy, Hindu nationalism, and heteropatriarchy. And they present the case for holding Indian diaspora accountable for acts of violence within a colonial settler nation like the US. As an Indian international student, what are your suggestions for Indian diaspora or immigrant diaspora to do futurity work? Thank you.
Thank you. So in previous work, I've talked about the fact that colonization is endemic. It's ubiquitous, and it's not just in the U.S., obviously. I would just say to you, I always have a little bit of nervousness about saying what anyone else should do. I can barely figure out which shoes to put on in the morning. I kind of, I'm like you all are. Some of you all remember Granimals, but I'm one of those things where I'm like, I just put all the giraffes together, and so then I've got the giraffe clothing. Look, I think the power of history and knowing history, it's one thing to know it. I think the point of for me, one of the things I take away from the power of your question is, what do we do about it? and having to have conversations. So there are a few nods in this talk where I'm like, we have to honor agreements that we've made, even if they are inconvenient to the descendants of the people who originally made them. That's a really hard thing for folks to wrap their brains around, because they've told themselves myths that they've earned this or that the time has gone. I think we have to have some pretty serious conversations about it. It was fascinating. There was I don't know if you all saw, Billie Eilish made these comments, and then all the right-wing bros jumped on her and told her to sell her house and other things, because she said we're all on Indian lands, and it's like, really, is this kind of where we are with this? So I think that colonial governments are going to have some pretty serious conversations about this. Our job as educators, it seems to me, is to put knowledge out there, to make some suggestions, not to tell people what to do. But it feels to me like, even though it's a U.S.-centric comment, I feel like the implications for other places, I hope, are important and interesting. So thanks for your really great question. Oh boy.
Hi, Dean. This is so great. Thank you so much. I'm thinking about what you said around not taking this as a narrative of victimization, and how prevalent the myths around the Indigenous past are in our lives, all of these myths that we know and inherited. And so I wanted to invite you to share maybe one story from the past that centers the practice of Indigenous educational self-determination and agency. I feel like we've heard so many powerful narratives around this erasure, and I'm sure there are stories that, with more time, you could tell us about resistance and Indigenous educational practices, reclaiming educational practices that existed beyond and before the boarding schools and things like that. So I just wanted to create the space for you to maybe share one of those true stories with us as we try to unlearn some of these myths. Yeah.
Will you just tell us who we are?
Oh, my name is Zinsley Riddick. I'm an assistant professor at the illustrious Northwestern University School of Education and Social Policy.
I suppose illustrious is in the eye of the beholder. I'm wearing a purple coat for whatever it's worth, my favorite color. Look, I sort of feel like Parker was doing that. 1911, a group of Shanina Loma-Waema's work is doing this. Some of Teresa McCarty and Shanina's work is doing this, and others are thinking about Society of American Indians, where there's a group of indigenous intellectuals who got together in Columbus, Ohio, of all places, in 1911, and really had a call to arms to say, we have to educate the public about things. Now, part of what SAI was doing, Society of American Indians, was really a push toward citizenship. So it's 1911. We don't get citizenship until 1924. I want you to think about that. And so I think that what SAI was doing, and what Parker was really writing as a representative of SAI, it was actually Carlos Montezuma, the professor that who's the first American Indian graduate of Northwestern, the chair that I hold, and other really important scholars were really resisting here. And if you read the piece in whole, it's just so biting in such a nice way. It's filled with just kind of digs against the government and digs against academics for doing it. For me, it's fundamentally an act of self-determination and doing the work, which is why I continue to be drawn to this piece. 1916 is also the year the AERA is founded. Terry and Shanina Loma-Waema's book, To Remain an Indian, has lots of examples of this, some of what Ananda Marin is doing. Linda Smith's work in New Zealand has all kinds of examples of this, but part of what I would say is it's 2026, and since 1492, maybe a little bit later than that. Let me just be kind and go to 1612 or 13. Like in those first winters, by the way, at Plymouth Rock, that the senator gets at about 10 years after that, and it was really Wampanoag peoples that helped the Pilgrims survive. There was a Thanksgiving in 1636 where they paraded around the chief's head on a stick, having defeated them, as part of really one of the early and first Thanksgivings. So it was 15 or 20 years after being helped that folks here decided, like, enough. It's been systematic since. And the fact that I'm here in this room as a result of my parents and my grandparents is probably the best, I don't know where Zenzele went, is probably the best example of that. But I just think that Terry and Shanina's work is great. It's phenomenal. Ananda's work is great. My colleague, our colleague, Megan Bang, Lynn Smith, Amanda Taccini, Tiffany Lee, the list kind of goes on. Leilani Subsalian, Meredith McCoy, like there are all these Native scholars who are writing about this stuff. Brenda Child. But for me, like, I'm here, which is kind of shocking to me. That kid with that crazy haircut and the homemade shirt is here. It's probably the best thing, because 35 out of 10,000 in terms of intentional, very sustained acts of genocide. I think just we're here, and the fact that we understand who we are is a pretty remarkable achievement in and of itself. So. Can I just say one more thing? I don't mean to make this about me, by the way. I'm just a representative of a whole bunch of people. Like, it's fundamentally not about me. I just happen to be I'm just here in my body, and there's a whole bunch of other people that I've named. But for all of us, like, the fact that we're around, the fact that we're on Tongva lands and those people are still here, it's not a thing of the past. Still kind of engaged, still driving what the city is doing and means. I thought the land acknowledgement last night that Kelly Stewart and Teresa Ambo offered was just, like, extraordinary. Like, that's the stuff. And I want us to do more than just, like, and to President Wynn's credit and to Janelle Scott's credit and to Tyrone's credit, like, past presidents, and I know future presidents, continue to do more than just a land acknowledgement. Like, that's, like, badass. And it's part of why I've come to really think that this organization of ours, like, we need to get there, and we're getting there because of leadership and because of other folks. Sorry.
No, that's okay.
I'm yapping.
Hi, how are you? Oh, let's clap again, please. Hi, how are you? I'm Brittany Hunt. I'm Lumbee, and I'm so excited. Of course I am. 575, happy federal recognition. Y'all don't know, but the Lumbee tribe just got federal recognition last year, December 19th. I just wanted to say that as a Lumbee person, as a Lumbee scholar, it means the world to me to hear you speak today, and it's very edifying for my spirit, and it means a lot to me. I met your dad last year at UNCP, and he was going there to pay for his table for the powwow. I think he has a table there every year or something. So I met him, and I was going on and on about you, and I was like, I love your son. He's amazing. He's the king of my academic world. And he looked at me like I was so strange, and clearly I am. So I just wanted to say, you're amazing, and I'm just so happy to be here. And I have a question. Do you have any advice or anything you would like to share for a Lumbee scholar like me or other Indigenous scholars in working in academic institutions that are not always conducive to our joy, and maybe don't maybe kind of keep us in a scarcity mindset a little bit a lot of times when we need to have the abundance mindset like you mentioned? And again, you're amazing, and you're the king of my academic world.
You just made me cry, and I'm such a baby anyway. My dad's 88, he's going to be 89 and on August 2nd. He's still powwowing. Like, it's just kind of, I don't know what to do with my dad. Still driving, which is not, drives me crazy. And still calling young women baby and honey. Look, I think the advice is probably true for everyone. Like, find your playmates. it's really important that we have people that we can connect with and be in this with. And I know you've got some of that at Virginia Tech. I'm a huge fan of your work too, Brittany. So find playmates, find a purpose. I just think there's really important. It's just having a conversation with someone, and I was telling the story about Barbara Rogoff, who's a mentor of mine, someone who I really deeply admire. And I was chasing grants early in my career, and she's like, "What are you doing? That's not your thing. You don't like that. Is that going to bring you joy?" And I said, "No, but I need the money." And she said, "Really? Find your thing, and the money will follow." And so be smart about it's like she was talking to a 7-year-old. And I love Barbara, and Barbara's a huge part of anything that I've done with this really important piece of advice. So I think finding like the stuff that really feeds you is pretty important. I always think it's important to understand the rules of engagement of the work, and understanding how to navigate those kinds of things. Write like crazy, and don't be constrained by what people tell you to write. Write. And I wrote this piece, and it's been my most cited piece, and I'm shocked every time I look up and something says to me, "Oh, it's been cited again," because I wrote it, and my chair at the time said to me, "I'm glad you got that out of your system. Now you can go back to doing real work." And I was like, "Oh no, I'm not having this." And so shortly after, I'm out of here. But I think that there was something important for me to say, I need to write this, that I think listening to yourself about that becomes really important. But find your playmate, have good relationships, keep your eye on the stuff, understand rules in terms of engagement, and find really good mentors. This room, I probably have 50 mentors in this room as I look around. Some of them are younger than me. Some of them are older than me. Some of them I've only known for a couple of years. Some of them I've known since I was a grad student. It's really important. I think one mentor is kind of crazy. You got to have a bunch of them, and then look for mentorship in all kinds of places that you may not necessarily expect it, and be curious and listen. So I think that's kind of the marker of this. A fundamental and deep belief in yourself is just so important to this work. And all of my mentors have really strong belief in themselves, and I'm grateful for it. Hi.
Hi, my name is Chong-Soo An. I'm from the University of Michigan.
Go Blue.
Yes. But throughout your talk, I just noticed there's so much mention of time where the past, present, and future are all entwined. And you open with saying the quote about presence. And then you also, later, you circle back to presence. And then there's these concepts of abundance and scarcity. But I was really struck by this idea of presence, especially in the second time that you brought it up as a way forward. And I would love to just hear a little bit more about how you're thinking about this, especially in relation to abundance, scarcity, and then in relation to time as well.
Thank you. It's a great question. They've all been great questions, just to be clear. I've been thinking about presence and absence for I don't know, it feels like a decade or decade and a half. It's probably longer than that, but really explicitly thinking about presence and absence, and thinking about abundance and scarcity really since the pandemic. I was in a set of weekly conversations with Linda and others. We met every week for, it felt like 2 years. We kept showing up during COVID, and this conversation about abundance and scarcity came up. Presence for me is the antidote to erasure and the antidote to absence. And I think that in lots of ways, the U.S. and its structures, its institutions are really rooted in absence and scarcity. Capitalism is about scarcity. Our schools rely on zero-sum ideas. In order to be in the 99th percentile, I think this is right, someone has to be in the first percentile. And so that's a wild thing, unless you're from Lake Wobegon, where everyone's like above average, right? The narrative goes. But I also think there has to be a presence about how we think and the way that we value things. So for me, there's all these questions not divorced from other parts of knowledge systems. So I think about knowledge systems as epistemologies, ontologies, pedagogies, axiologies, and cosmologies. How we know, how we be our realities, how we teach and learn, what we value, and what our origins are. But what we know and how we know it is embedded in all of that, and it just feels to me like we absent a bunch of the knowledge, which I think is really important because we have a way of defining like what's important. And I really want to push against that as part of my argument, like to Dr. Hunt, to Brittany, was really to say, like, write the stuff you want to write that you think other people need to hear is about a move of presence, actually, and a refusal to be erased. But more importantly, like, it's less about that than it is about saying, I want to be seen in this way. It's a fundamental assertion of self-determination to say, this is my presence, right? I'm not going to apologize for the way I'm dressed today. It's part of my presence. It's traditional because I'm in it. Like, it's my body that's in it. And so I'm choosing to be present and offer presence in this particular way. And that for me feels like really critically important as a way of a form of resistance, maybe of resurgence that's there, but an openness to have others kind of show up in whatever ways they do feels really important. I think we are so, in the US, this is probably not true in other places to the extent, although I feel like capitalism is a little bit like colonization, it's ubiquitous. Our mentalities about who should have stuff and then who shouldn't just feel so pervasive to me that I just feel like, when will we kind of say enough of this? I work at a place, and I really like my job, and I like my place, and I love my colleagues. Like, I'm proud of my school. Let me say this differently. I'm proud of our school where I get a chance to work. And the way that we think about merit there trips me out a lot. The introduction that President Wynn gave, and I'm thinking, is that me? Like, trips me out a little bit because of all of the stuff that it's there. And I think, I don't know that it's going to go away, but I do think having conversations about what counts as merit, what counts, period, how we think about this is going to be really important for us moving forward. It's part of why I worry about the how having overtaken the why. And it's why I just think, and it's part of why I think the why becomes necessary for us. So let's create the conditions. It doesn't mean that, like, we do things differently. It doesn't mean it's less rigorous. I hate that word, by the way, but we can't have rigor mortis without rigor, for whatever it's worth. But the hardness of it, that it does, and I like, it's not personal attack on anybody in here. I use it, but I don't like it very much. I just wonder about flexibility and plasticity and an ability to kind of like stretch our institutions and force our institutions to be bigger and wider and more open. I think it's actually better for us. Sometimes stuff's bad, and so you got to say that's bad, right? So I think that's important too, but I think it's got to be clear about why you think it's bad, and to help people understand that. That's a rambling ass answer, but that's the best I got. Thank you, boss. Go ahead for the